Why would I even write about Caged Heat today? Did I expect that this film might be of some interest due to it being directed by Jonathan Demme, but there was some hip, subversive, creative cult quality about it? I figured I may as well give it a spin just so I could have a frame of reference for when people would cite it. I'm not sure how often people in discourse will be mentioning Caged Heat, possibly as one of Demme's films, possibly as some ironic, slightly underground cult favourite, potentially as some, oh, it's sexist, but we like it because being contradictory is playfully gaslighting to our critics, tee hee hee, or whatever. But I've seen it around and decided I may as well know what people are thinking of when they feel it is worth mentioning Caged Heat. The first thing one notices is that Caged Heat is generally far better directed than other films of its identified bracket, and demonstrates the filmic gifts which Jonathan Demme would later manifest more so in some subsequent work, and even compared to the sleazy episodes of Jesus Franco's output, there is a slickness and directorial creativity which goes beyond the occasionally ornate stagings of Franco's films and appears as considered displays of an interior space, of players' motion across a set. More tense and action oriented scenes in Caged Heat are rather competently directed and may assist Caged Heat in motivating devotees in championing what some may assume or dismiss otherwise as softcore porno adjacent junk. So, how would I assess Caged Heat then overall? I cannot deny that I don't find it an overly captivating viewing experience, and the whole women in prison thing, being all secretly empowering or camp or whatever, is not a clique I ever aspired to be a part of, just seemed to be a bit too boring for me. Some may like the girl power angle, but I would sooner name these as saving graces before I would them the conductors of any enjoyment. These elements serve to energize the film experience, although at the core is a work which is ultimately uninteresting and generally banal, and I'm aggressively disinterested in acquiring chic, so I won't pretend that this film holds more value than it really does, though not that it possesses no value at all either. Beyond the more superficial, surface level qualities of the female form, which are not unenjoyed, but just not entirely the most impressive choice creatively, any feature film can display exciting nudity. It is not a revelation or something which, in and of itself, earn the film points, although it can, compared with similarly unmemorable films without it. We cannot deny that. Beyond this, I am not very sure what the wider appeal of Caged Heat may be, because it is slightly cheekily, ironically enjoyed by those who consider themselves of a more faux progressive, university centric clique. Though, at least in part, because Caged Heat gives a redemptive, in these viewers' eyes, nod to some assertive feminist convictions, and they can feel pat on the back for simply finding some appreciation of it. This is their self celebrating logic. I can't claim to have ever liked these people very much when I've ever interacted with them, although it wouldn't prevent these same people from assessing some one of the more genuinely misogynist and sadistically sleazy women in prison works as actually empowering of chic merit, or ironically so very feminist in its own confounding perplexing way. Anything to potentially trigger the cultural conservatives via those hacky tee hee hee contradictions. This is all those pests live for. They cannot consider an internally convicted or consistent set of values that are their own, so they have to filter it through who opposes it or who supports it. There's a lot less people who would have spoken out against the lack of rights for minorities prior to or even during the 1960s in the more developed world than currently claim they totally, definitely would have. A lot less of them, and that's why they're so frenzied, I sometimes strongly suspect. I'm wondering whether Caged Heat would have as much of a place if the contradictions or otherwise tensions in society were unknotted or just smoothed out, whether we just think of it in 80 years from now as a bizarre way of either delivering a pro feminist message or an even more bizarre way to claim your support for those political stances via claiming that one admires this vaguely multipolar quasi exploitation fare. I can just imagine this being screened at a university. Not that it would, in of itself, but if it were, via the Film Society of the campus, I would likely detest any self-satisfied, chic, thirsty rodent who praised the film beyond declaiming it was not bad, pretty good, or okay. I'd get along more with the feminists who decry it as sexist more than the ones who claim it's actually so empowering, because when we claim it is, the cultural conservatives say we're contradicting ourselves, and we all giggle to ourselves, tee hee hee, or whatever sickening garbage they live for. Acting or making decisions based on the prospective reactions of others is one of the most worthless motivations available to a modern human pathology. Now, Jonathan Demme himself was a genuinely interesting film director, and across his decade spanning career, he helmed some rather interesting work and had a truly fascinating decision making ethos when approaching maybe otherwise recognizable Hollywood geared narrative dramas. I recall that the infamous and over discussed, mostly, film critic Armand White was once bemoaning that the three directors constantly discussed by the young cinephile discourse was Kubrick slash Tarantino slash Nolan. It might not have been Nolan. It could have been someone else. I don't exactly recall whom. As opposed to, I think, Griffith slash Renoir slash Demme. It might have been Godard instead of Griffith, but I don't think he placed two French directors in that trio, though maybe he did. To some of us in the age bracket I believe White was referring to, we weren't really understanding the eminence of Demme. Certainly those of us outside the US, Demme's relevance as an American filmmaker to the US culture, that can be accepted and understood, though his interest to those of us, more interested in wider world cinema was not entirely obvious. Altman is a similar case, and also someone whom Mr. White is very eager to adulate and praise at every given opportunity. Over some time, I did manage to yield a great admiration of Demme's films, and beyond just a degree of appreciation for The Silence of the Lambs, a film which I still wholly enjoy and admire, but I think some I'm superior to the average person young cinephiles were determined not to like it. Maybe having something to do with the issue of Buffalo Bill. I don't care about that. It's not my battle. I'll sign your legislation, but attacking certain beloved films to devise a headline or just due to attention seeking, surely there are better ways to support or empower such relevant movements. You're smart enough to know that, I assume. Due to it being a widely liked movie in the general public. As it happens, Demme directed lots of films beyond just Silence of the Lambs and composed some interesting films in different eras, of which only a certain autorial idiosyncrasy and convicted creativity unites them. The so-called fingerprints are not obvious, though not absent, in Demme's output. There was the fascinating 70s features, Fighting Mad, Handle with Grace, and Last Embrace, films which still seem underrated to an extent within Demme's prolific filmography. Some intriguing projects from the 80s, the most captivating for me being the 82 television production Who Am I This Time, based on a short story by Kurt Vonnegut, the concert film of spoken word artist Spalding Gray, Swimming to Cambodia, released in 1987, and the elucidating documentary work Haiti Dreams of Democracy of 1988. Demme has other more well-known and celebrated films of the 1980s, though I wanted to keep it a bit briefer and focus upon the pictures which I find to be of the most interest, because otherwise we'll be here for a while discussing many works from Mr. Demme. Then the 90s was Demme's most successful and mainstream of the 5 decades he made films through. Obviously, Silence of the Lambs was released in 91, but also Philadelphia he directed from 93, which I think is a better film than it is sometimes given contemporary credit for. No one seems to dislike it, but it may be remembered as too Oscar-baity, but is a very well-arranged and realised film beyond the actor-centric components of it, which are still highly impressive, I'd say. Less known, but also worth watching, in 1992's Cousin Bobby, a documentary feature about Demme's cousin, Robert W. Castle, who was an Episcopalian minister in Harlem, known for an assertive activist streak and for placing written flyers on police cars that were illegally parked on the sidewalk in front of his church, which led to a newspaper article that ended up reuniting the cousins in question. I'm also quite interested in what I've seen of 1998's Storefront Hitchcock, a concert film of the great, highly peculiar though immensely creative singer-songwriter Robin Hitchcock, whose 1984 album I Often Dream of Trains is a fantastic listening venture, and I intend to maybe one day discuss more of Demme's interesting works in some greater detail. In the 21st century, the Demme films which I have really rather liked are the 2004 remake of The Manchurian Candidate, a stellar and still relatively underrated work, highly worthy of a still admirable and incredibly well-devised original feature, and a 2013 film adaptation of a Henrik Ibsen play called A Master Builder, starring Wallace Shawn, Julie Haggerty, Larry Pine, and the lesser-known though intensely gifted performer Lisa Joyce. A Master Builder might be my choice for my favourite Jonathan Demme work, supremely smartly directed, expertly performed, and obviously excellently scripted, from Wallace Shawn himself as it would happen. I would very highly recommend A Master Builder to any who have not yet seen it, and especially to those who are admirers of Demme, although those of you have presumably already gotten around to seeing it or are otherwise planning on eventually seeing it. On the general whole, I really do quite admire Demme's films, and even those which I am at least personally less interested in, be it Melvin and Howard, Something Wild, Rachel Getting Married, which is still a rather decent work, I can't deny that at all, obviously, or Ricky and the Flash, which I'd sooner deny any quality manifesting in or around that. Regardless, I can appreciate his unique idiosyncrasies as a auteur in the sort of relatively mainstream American environment. He wasn't an outsider. Well, he was almost an outsider filmmaker, though at one time he most certainly was not. That's during the 1990s. And even, it's not like he's... No, I don't know if I'd call him outsider. But he had the scent of an outsider film, a slightly outsider independent filmmaker during the 21st century. We could maybe claim. I think he is an interesting filmmaker, and I think those who are perhaps lost on why Demme would be considered a visionary film director are not really appreciating the finesse at which Demme frames his staged conversations within the fictional dramas, which he masters as well as a Renoir or a Bergman, a Kazan, or even a Neruse. But yes, on Caged Heat again, it has some identifiable merits, for I'd sooner respect someone who called it one of their favourite movies because of the liberal nudity, as opposed to someone who claimed it was due to the film's ironic or otherwise camp or allegedly stridently political nature, because the latter component is so secondary and generally minor compared with the film's want to entice ticket payers via the sex appeal, shock value, or any quasi-subversive cinematic zaniness. Actually, I'd sooner respect someone who accused it of being sexist. At least their position is overall consistent, and they have a set of values and principles which they are assertively committed to. If I never see Caged Heat again, I won't feel too upset by it. I doubt I'd ever place it on my own volition ever again, though if someone else was watching it, I might be slightly intrigued to see it play out again, and it can be fun with select company, maybe, possibly, as long as that company isn't cheekily, ironically, gaslightingly claiming that it is really actually genius, empowering, or otherwise progressive political cinema. In that case, I'll have to at least strongly consider making a hole in the TV with this person's head, but presumably just making a hole in the wall as I storm out of wherever we are watching the film. I won't do them the courtesy of using their door. They can pay to fix their wall. The price one pays for being a vapid, headline-hungry, hot-take composing, opinions presented on the shelf, rodent little cunt. Objectification of nudity is progressive. Objectification of nudity is aggressive. I'm more on the side of the human body being considered uncontroversial, rather than an inherent political statement pro or anti-patriarchy. For the so-called sex-negative wing of feminism, whilst I don't agree with them on probably lots of things, they undeniably have a more consistent set of values and principles than the sex-positive, who are seemingly more concerned with how their beliefs cause people to react, and that includes a lot of the behaviour itself, to be contemptuously blunt, than in assessing a set of beliefs which make any sort of coherent, justifiable sense. As long as you don't act in ways that are dependent on how others see you, acting independently on what others might think of you, how they might judge you, or how they might potentially exclude you, in attempts to avoid harm, it might be justified to be concerned with others, but this is totally understandable and accepted by all as an extreme variant of these potential situations. As long as you are acting as you would without worrying about how others might judge your threshold of belief, you are quite well possibly acting in a moral way, or at least in a way that I would inherently admire more than someone who conversely wasn't doing so. That is, if the subject in question was at all claiming any moral credibility. Any psychotic quasi-fascists or fascists may use such ambivalence to others' opinions to justify their own brutish, supremacist, bullying behaviours. But if you are at all going to claim a distinctly moral disposition within oneself, letting those moral convictions flourish even in the light of others' potentially disapproving, mocking, or otherwise exclusionary opinions, that is at least the sign of someone who is making an effort, if nothing else at all, to be a little bit more moral than humanity has been behaving throughout most of its lengthy, recorded, and very terribly bloody histories.